Welcome to My Life, Tanya Applied, with Rabbi Simon Jacobson, a journey into the deepest teachings of Torah and their application to our personal, emotional, and psychological lives.
A good tavoch, a good week. We continue our journey in the life-changing Sefer Tanya. This program is made possible by Rena Lights LLC, and it is in honor and memory of Rabbi Yosef Halevi Weinberg Olav Shalom, Rabbi Moshe Pinchas HaKoyen Katz Olav Shalom, Rabbi Yael HaKoyen Khan Olav Shalom, and it is in schus and merit of Rabbi Zev Yecheskel HaKoyen and Risha Katz La'erich Yomim V'Shonim Tevis for many long, healthy years. We are close to the end of chapter 7, Perek Zayin in Tanya, and the Alter Rebbe in this chapter, continuing the theme of the chapter 6, is talking about the negative forces in life. In contrast to chapters 2, 3, 4, and 5, where he talked about the Nefesh Elokis, the divine soul, its personality, its faculties, its garments, its ways of manifesting. We're now going in chapter 6. He entered back in Zelu Umazeh, the alter ego, the mirror image of the animal soul, which has, just like in the divine soul, 10 faculties, the animal soul has 10 faculties. And here we're talking about Klippa. Klippa is the world of shells, where the divine is concealed, as he explained in chapter 6. That Kedusha is everything that is sublimated, everything that is not committed to itself, but to a higher cause, bottle. What he said, bottle, which means that it's sublimated and completely selflessly dedicated to a cause greater than itself, in this case, God. That's Kedusha. Klippa, Sitra Acher, is anything that does not have that bittul, that has its own egocentric identity and consciousness. In that itself, there are two levels. There's Klippa Snega and there's Sholosh Klippas Atmeis. The order he began at the end of chapter 6 was Sholosh Klippas Atmeis, the harsher dimension, which means the three impure shells, where they're the good, and the spark of the divine is completely concealed, and therefore it's off limits. Like he'll say later in chapter 7 that we learned, Osir v'kosher b'dei chetzenim. Dvorim asurim, the things that are forbidden, are destructive, means it's an area where we shouldn't go. Klippas Nega, on the other hand, is not an area that's destructive. It can be going both directions. For example, when a person eats or sleeps, or other activities that go into the neutral category of reshus, can be used both ways, can go both directions. You can use it and elevate it to Kedusha, when you eat L'Shem Shemayim, like he spoke about in the beginning of chapter 7. When a person eats and drinks, and he's using the strength of that to sharpen his mind, like he said, strong wine, powerful fragrance. Same thing with food. Eating basar shmeno, which is a fattened meat, and he's eating it in order to sharpen the mind, in order to study Torah, or to the mitzvah of Einik Shabbos and Yontiv, the pleasure, fulfilling the mitzvah of pleasure, physical pleasure on Shabbos and holidays, then you're elevating it. If you eat it for self-indulgent purposes, then you degrade it, at least temporarily, and allow it to enter the realm of the Sholosh Klippas Atmeis. But that can be easily freed when you, like you said, Yoshev, or a person returns, which means he returns that spark that descended temporarily into the dark place and brings it back to Kedusha. So that's not called destructive. So destructive behavior is not something you go to. You don't go ahead and do something destructive and say, for example, consuming something toxic or behaving in a toxic fashion. That's not something that's something off limits. That's called Osir v'kosher b'dei chetzenim. When it comes to Rishus, Klippas Nega, it's dover mutter. It's allowed. What means mutter? It means it's unbound. Osir means it's bound and tied up, locked up, like being held hostage in the darkness of existence. And when they say mutter, it means it's unbound. And therefore you can elevate it. However, it could also be degraded. That's all Klippas Nega. So then in the next half of chapter 7, which we learned, he said that's all correct when you're talking about Klippas Nega. Mashen came, but my cholos asuris. But then when it comes to forbidden food, forbidden things to eat, and bias asuris, and forbidden sexual relations, as the Alter Rebbe says, and he chooses these two as we discussed, based on the Shalah, that sees these are the two general categories that contaminate and toxify the very body. Because when we eat, the food we eat becomes part of who we are. And the same thing, sexual relations, it creates, from that a child is born. So sexual relations creates something, and it's also bodily, the bodily pleasure. So these are the two dominant toxic behaviors or destructive behaviors. Those are asurim v'kshurim b'deach etzenim le'elam. And that, those are bound and off limits. But dafka asurim, things that are forbidden, asuris, macholos asuris or bias asuris. This is not referring to macholos mutaris, things that are allowed to be eaten, kosher things, or a relationship a person has in a sacred marriage. That's all the category of klippas nega, like we said. That could be elevated because it's not bound up and tied up in the darkness of the toxic energy of the shalosh klippas atmeis, of the three impure shells, trapped there. However, he gave two exceptions. It's not really two exceptions, we should say. That is locked there until the day will come, until their day will come, which is the Osid Lavi in the future, and death will be swallowed up forever. And like it says, that the spirit of impurity will be removed from the earth completely. What does that mean? That Shalosh Klippas will no longer exist. Those negative, toxic, and destructive forces will no longer exist. The sparks that were trapped in there will be redeemed, and that's the future, the transformation of existence. It's not like it is today. Oi, and this came what we learned last week, is we can do that also to some extent today as well, and that's through tshuva, but not regular tshuva. Sheyasa tshuva gdela kol kach. It has to be a great form of tshuva that transforms transgressions into merits. Zdeinus nasalei kazochis mamish. And what tshuva is that? He explains tshuva ma'ava ma'umke deliba ba'ava rabav chasheka v'nefesh sheka kol dovka b'yizbarach. It has to be a deep love that comes from the depths of his heart. A profound thirst of a part soul, feeling the distance, that has the power. Because you feel the distance of being in that dark place. So initially you're not allowed to go there, but if someone did end up there, if that in turn becomes a catalyst that creates this tremendous thirst from the ditracha and the sense of feeling distance, the distress of the soul feeling, and this is a far deeper thirst than any tzaddik will have. A tzaddik also thirsts godliness, but not with the same passion, the same intensity that someone who hasn't drank water for who knows how long, a part soul. And that's, like it says, then the place where Balei Tshuva stand, tzaddikim gemurim cannot stand or are incapable of standing. And tshuva ma'avar rabazu, this type of tshuva, from this profound love, this great love, this has the power, similar to what will be in the future, to pull, to extract, to literally extract those sparks, those divine sparks from the dark hole, the black hole where they were trapped, which on our own we could never reach. Why? Because it's specifically because falling in that place where a person transgressed, that ultimately created this deep thirst. And that empowered the sparks to be freed. Like in a sense, when you really come to a shock treatment, so to speak, hitting rock bottom, that pulls out those sparks, they get elevated, and that has the power to create zdeinus naslei kazochis, that even deliberate sins, transgressions, and liabilities become merits, zochis. But a tshuva that doesn't come from this level of ava is also, even though it's a proper tshuva, and God will forgive him, it doesn't become merits for him. And there, you need to rely, if it's not a tshuva ma'ava, there you have to rely that the full redemption, ein elam ha-klipa legamri, the sparks do not elevate from this klipa, ad eis keit sheyevula hamoves lenetzach, Only in the future, Ace Cates, when the time will come. The time will come in the future, like we said before, and the death will be swallowed up forever. Lanetzach, forever. Okay, what we have here so far, and this is where we stopped, what we have here so far is covered the different angles in the thorough nature and the inimitable way the Alter Rebbe explains thoroughly the whole picture. So chapters 2, 3, 4, 5 we discussed is all the Kedusha, the holiness of the divine soul and how it manifests, its faculties and its garments. Now we're talking about the negative side, because we do live in a world where it's not a world of pure holiness. We learned earlier it's a world actually Elam Mole Klippas V'Sitra Achre. It's a world filled with the opposite, with ego, with arrogance, with an egocentric consciousness, which is the essence of Klippa. And two levels, to the point, Shalosh Klippas Atmeyas, but even Klippas Nege, even the so-called bright shell, the radiant shell is also a Klippa and can go both directions. So that's what he covers in chapters 6 and 7, and also 8, which we'll learn after we finish chapter 7. So here he's talking about the other side, but he's also covering the different scenarios. So first we covered at the end of chapter 6, the Alter Rebbe, that which is completely off limits. In the beginning of chapter 7, he went to Klippas Nege, that which is neutral and can go either direction, that he called the fourth Klippa, after the three impure, the fourth one, which is a Klippa Mumutzas, like an interface, because it can go in both directions. It can go and be elevated to holiness when you eat properly and do all these things that are allowed in a proper way, because the sparks are not bound and trapped. Or it can go the other direction, where a person unfortunately chooses the wrong way, and those sparks then temporarily go into the negative. And he gave plenty of examples. He gave example of food, he gave example of fragrance, he gave example of humor, which can go in both directions. Then he went back, Mashen came, Acholas Asuris and Bias Asuris, back to Shalosh Klippas Atmeyas, and picking the two main categories, forbidden and prohibited foods, as well as prohibited sexual relations, where there it's completely off limits. However, the Alter Rebbe wants to qualify. It's not just an end story. The Osadove, that will be completely purified, and today through Teshuva Ma'ava we can also transform it. If it's not Teshuva Ma'ava, which he also qualifies, in other words, in Teshuva too there are levels, so you don't completely redeem those sparks until the future, but there's a Teshuva, basically the human being is forgiven, but you still brought something toxic and destructive in the world, and it wasn't transformed. The only way to transform is through Ava, where the negative has become a positive. Why? Because it has led you to a deep thirst that connects you to the divine, to Kedusha, in a way that even Kedusha could not reach. Like he said, Tzaddikim on their own don't have such a deep connection. So not only is it like Klippas Nege being elevated in Kedusha, that's possible when you eat L'Shem Shemaim, you eat for the sake of heaven. You eat in order to learn Torah properly, to have strength. Or the other examples that he gave. Here we're talking about something that was off limits. And off limits is something that creates brings destructive energy into this world. So in the future, that will be eliminated. What about today? Only if that leads the person to such a deep passion and intense love, Ava Rabbah, because of the deep thirst, then it's redeemed. Because it leads you to a place that nothing else can lead you, even more than Kedusha. You hear? Even more than Kedusha, even more than Tzaddikim. Kedusha is initially connected to the divine. And then that can permeate even the neutral things we do, like eating and drinking and sleeping and other material things that we're involved in. But the negative cannot be redeemed, except when you have this type of level of tshuva, because the negative itself has become a positive, because it's led us to the much deeper connection, which basically means godliness. The godliness he spoke about that comes through bittul, came through the completely opposite, but you came to even a deeper bittul, a deeper love, a deeper connection. Okay, but a tshuva, anything less than that, so you can be forgiven, but the toxins still remain in the world. The only way to get rid, again, of toxins in this world today is through tshuva ma'ava. Now, what means in the world? It doesn't mean everywhere, because you're only talking about this person. You've done tshuva for your transgressions, for God forbid. for your deliberate zdeinus, deliberate sins. So even if a person reaches this level of tshuva ma'ava, the world still needs ruach hatum ma'ava min ha'aretz, unless everybody does such a level of tshuva. So we still need Mashiach coming. If someone asked the question, why do you need Mashiach? We could just say everyone should do this tshuva ma'ava, because it's unlikely that everyone's doing that level of tshuva. They may do a lower level of tshuva nechena that they get forgiven, but the toxic energy is still there. L'osadovi, that will be wiped away. Today, it's wiped away for the person who's able to transform it to the tshuva of love. And I'm elaborating because to show every possible scenario. But now, as we come to the end of the chapter, the Alter Rebbe still wants to cover a few bases here, a few scenarios that he didn't address. Remember, the two key categories is Maicholas Asuris and Bias Asuris. In the words of the Shalah, the actual language of the Shalah, let me read to you the actual language, because it's very powerful. What he says is as follows. This is the lashon of the Shalah. Shara Esis is Gedusha. Yesh harba da'araisu da'rabanan mehilchus meicholas asuris ki inyan ha'achila machaya kol haguf v'dugma ze inyan habiyah mahava kol haguf shememena neilad. So he's saying basically there are many different things that are forbidden, but the forbidden foods is machaya the guf, it sustains the body, and similarly biyah, which is sexual relations, mahava kol haguf. That's what creates the entire body, because that's how one births a child. So kadesh atzma b'chshein b'kedushas meichel b'kedushas habiyah. So a person has to sanctify himself in these two primary interactions or activities in the material world that both are connected to the body in the fullest sense of the word. Shar mitzvos hateva einam esim reishim gufni. Other mitzvos hateva don't quite make the same impact on the body, meaning a physical impact on the physical body. But these two things, food sustains the body, and sexual relations, intimacy, creates the body. And the impact of that remains forever. So now, once he's covered that, he's going to go back now to bias asudis, to sexual issues, sexual relations. But there's two aspects to this. That's what we're going to learn now. So a short introduction. He's going to talk about emitting seed. He saw zera levatola, which is emitting seed for wasted seed. And then he's going to talk about actual inappropriate sexual relations that are forbidden in the Torah. And he's going to say that what we just said about shalosh klippos hatmeis, which applies to both these things, however, there's a key difference. So even though, generally speaking, Chassidus Chabad doesn't really talk much about that chet hayadua, which is essentially emitting shmiras habris, which is emitting seed wastefully, but in Ageres HaTshuvah, some Chassidim say the Alter Rebbe wrote it in order to help repair that, because it's such a fundamental sin that's so common and needs to be addressed. So there is one or two places the Alter Rebbe speaks about it more directly. And one of this, Ageres HaTshuvah is one, and one is here at the end of chapter 7. But it's an interesting paradox he's going to speak about. He's going to say that even though that also goes in the category of shalosh klippos hatmeis, emitting seed wastefully, and yet, relatively speaking, it's easier to redeem than other forbidden sins. And that's why it's not enumerated, it's not counted in the book of Vayikra, where it talks about forbidden sexual relations. You don't have emitting seed wastefully as one of that. That's not to minimize it, but he's going to make a key distinction. So this is just the whole thoroughness to cover all the situations that are most common. So he's now going to discuss that there's an exception, that even though we said before you need to have tshuva ma'ava, dafka, this deep love and passion to transform and elevate the sparks from shalosh klippos hatmeis, from this dark place, from this black hole. Yet, there's an exception when it comes to emitting seed wastefully. And by contrast, sexual relations with another person that is forbidden in the Torah is not in that category. There you dafka need tshuva ma'ava. Or la'asad lavi, when all toxins will be erased. So that's what he's going to address now. So let's read inside. So he says like this. Ach, however, so this is an exception. Ach, after just explaining that only tshuva ma'ava, this deep love that creates this deep thirst and passion and intensity, can transform sholosh klippos atmeis, basically zdeinus, deliberate sins, into merits, and any tshuva lower than that can elevate partially, but not completely, until the future when death will be completely swallowed up, death referring to all negative forces and impurities. However, here's the exception. The energy in the drops of seed, or semen, that a person emitted wastefully, they are a different category. Well, what is the category? Af sheyarda v'nichlala b'shalosh klippos atmeis. So even though this energy, the wasteful seed, has been downgraded and absorbed in the three impure klippos, in the three impure shells, because remember, the very fact that a person can emit seed is not shalosh klippos atmeis, that's klippos nega. It can go in different directions. Like we actually learned earlier, that in klippos nega, when a person, even with their spouse, in a sacred marriage, it's a mitzvah actually to emit seed and give birth to a child if God blesses them with a child. Yet even there, klippos nega, if he doesn't do it with the proper intentions, like he said earlier, when he spoke about, he said that just to go back to the language. What was it? That the energy in the seed that is released, emitted from him, but taiva bamis, the animal pleasure, indulgence. But there he's talking, that's klippos nega, because he's together with his wife intimately, and she's pure. However, his intention is not in the right place. So that we spoke about it, but the seed that's wasted, so the actual emitting of seed is klippos nega. But hafsheyarda v'nichla b'shalosh klippos atmeis, because it's wasted and it's not connected to a sacred union, intimacy with in a sacred marriage with his spouse, it's wasted seed. So even though that's the case, so nevertheless, though it's gone into shalosh klippos atmeis, here's an exception. That nevertheless it can ascend from there relatively easily, but tshuva nechena. Remember, the word tshuva nechena was used a few lines before, that even though it's not tshuva ma'ava requires the intense love. Here, tshuva nechena means an appropriate tshuva where he's forgiven. So for the emitting of seed wastefully, he's saying the exception is here, you only need tshuva nechena. An appropriate tshuva, ubekavona atzuma b'kriya shma shalamita. So you don't need the tshuva ma'ava, just a regular, so to speak, appropriate tshuva, ordinary tshuva, but it comes along, but it's along with intense concentration, kavona atzuma, during the recital of Shema at bedtime. K'nei de Arizal, like we know from the Arizal. And that's in Pri Etz Chaim, in the Chelik of Krishma, Shalamita, chapter 5. So, yes, he's adding b'kavona tzuma, but he says tshuva nechena. So essentially, the tshuva does not require that depth of intense love like it's required in other sins to transform that into merits. However, it needs a kavona tzuma. But kavana tzuma doesn't mean tshuva ma'ava. That's the key distinction here. So you don't have to have an extraordinary form of tshuva out of love. You just need to have the remorse, a proper remorse, and resolve not to do it again, to emit seed wastefully. And that trapped energy then, in the shalosh klippos atmeis of the seed that's wasted, can be redeemed when you concentrate intensely during Krishma, during the Shema that you say before sleep, before bedtime. Now the Alter Rebbe is going to add that this unique special power of Krishma is hinted to in the Gemara, in the Talmud. So on the Posuk in Tehillim, Kuf Mem Tes Hey, 149.5, the Gemara in Brochus, Hey Amud Aleph 5a says the following. The Alter Rebbe quotes it. Umerumas beGemara, and this is hinted to in the Gemara, in the Talmud. What does he say there? Kol hakreya kriya shma al mitosei. Anyone that recites the Shema at bedtime, al mitosei meaning at near his bed, but it means basically bedtime Shema before we go to sleep. So the Gemara says, Ki ilu oiches cherev shel shtei pies. Shel shtei pies chulu. It is as if he held a double-edged sword. So what does that mean? What is this sword representing? Why is it a sword? So the Alter Rebbe explains. It's considered, the Krishma Shalamit is considered like a sword. A sword was what? It strikes your enemies. It's a weapon. The sword destroys the negative agents, the negative forces. Or you could say the negative bodies that are created. That became garments and vehicles, so to speak, absorbing the energy from the drops of seed that were emitted wastefully. That's what Krishma does. Krishma Shalamita. So Shema, before going to sleep, has the power to destroy that, which essentially supports what he just said before. That Tshuva Nechena, you have to have an ordinary level of remorse, not necessarily Tshuva Ma'ava, but when you have the Kavanah Suma during Shema, so the Gemara says clearly that it destroys, like a sword destroys. Again, let's read Gufis Achitzenim, because remember the seed that's omitted, the drops of seed, is physical. And when you do it wastefully, not absorbed in a sacred way, in an intimate relation, in a sacred way with one spouse, so that becomes levush l'chayish b'tipus. That became now the negative, the l'hadik gufis achitzenim, these negative bodies, so to speak, that became a garment, a vehicle for the chayis, for the energy and the seed, because the seed is being used wastefully. So the Shema is like a sword that destroys it, and enables the energy to rise from them, extracting essentially the energy of that seed, which has the power to give birth to a child when it's used in the proper way. So that's the way we can do it, and that requires a tshuva, regular tshuva, plus this intense, the kavanah tzuma, a very powerful intention during Shema. Ki yadua leyedei chen, as is known to the masters of chen, which is either chachma stada or chen itself, represents the hidden wisdom of Kabbalah. So here we'll stop here, and we'll continue next week, Mitzvah Hashem. Everyone have a good week. TanyaApplied.com. You can find all these programs. Thank you so much.
This has been My Life, Tanya Applied with Rabbi Simon Jacobson. Please join us again next week. Visit ChasidusApplied.com for archived classes and more resources.